The alpine sky pilot, Polemonium viscosum, grows in the Rocky Mountains near the timberline. Sky pilot populations are found in two different environments. In the tundra above timberline, bumblebees pollinate sky pilots. The flowers of these sky pilots are large. No one has studied how they smell to insects, but to humans they smell sweet. In the forest below timberline, flies are the main pollinators of sky pilots. The flowers of fly-pollinated sky pilots are small and smell skunky to us. In general, flies respond to flowers that smell skunky to us, and bees respond to those that smell sweet. As illustrated in these histograms, flower size differs between the tundra population and the forest population. Why might these two populations differ? In studying these populations, the scientist Candace Gallin proposed that natural selection was responsible for the observed difference in flower size. If natural selection is at work, then its four postulates should be true. Postulate 1 states that there is variation in the population. Postulate 2 states that at least some of this variation is heritable. Postulate 3 states that more individuals are born than can survive and reproduce. Postulate 4 states that some individuals are more likely than others to produce a greater number of offspring. Now let's explore each of these postulates in the alpine sky pilot populations to answer this question. Is natural selection responsible for the observed difference in flower size between these populations? Variation must exist among individuals within a population if natural selection is to occur. This is the first postulate of natural selection. Gallin measured flower size in the two populations to test if variation existed in these populations. Keep in mind that variation is needed for future natural selection, but lack of variation does not rule out selection having occurred in the past. When evaluating populations, it is important to recognize that there is variation within a single population and variation between different populations. From these two graphs, you should observe both types of variation. The first postulate of natural selection applies to the variation within a single population. Let's look first at the tundra population. Gallin's measurements showed the average flower diameter to be 16 millimeters, but individual flowers within the population ranged from 10 to 22 millimeters in diameter. The average flower diameter in the forest population was 14 millimeters, but individual flower diameters ranged from 12 to 20 millimeters. As you can see from the data, both populations exhibited variation in flower size. In the family on the left, the individuals tend to have small flowers. In the family on the right, the individuals tend to have large flowers. How do biologists know that family resemblance is related to genetics and not just the environment? Postulate 2 of natural selection states that some variation in a population must be heritable for selection to work. To discover whether flower size is heritable in sky pilots, Gallin planted 617 seeds from bumblebee-pollinated individuals into randomized plots at the upper edge of the timberline. When they had grown old enough to flower, she graphed the flower sizes of the mothers against those of the offspring. How do you interpret her graph? Do you see any relationship between the mothers and their offspring? As is often the case, the results of such a graph are not visually obvious. A scientist can perform a statistical analysis and plot a regression line or best fit line. In this case, the slope of the line measures the heritability of the trait. What does the line tell you about the relationship between the mothers and their offspring? The slope of the line fitted through the points is positive, indicating a relationship, although with some variation, between parents and offspring. The size of the flowers in the offspring increases as the size of the parent flowers increase. Because the environments of the plants were randomized in this experiment, the similarities shown here must be the result of alleles shared by parents and offspring. The third postulate of natural selection concerns the limited survival and reproductive success of individuals. From the tundra population, Gallin found that out of 617 seedlings planted, only 58 survived to flower 7 years later. This is a survival rate of about 1 in 12 individuals, within the normal range for a natural population. Thus, the population fulfills the third postulate of natural selection. The fourth postulate of natural selection requires that some individuals produce more offspring than others. In Gallen's experiment, she proposed that bumblebees are responsible for this differential success of sky pilots. How could you test this hypothesis? This scatter plot records Gallen's data on flower preference by bumblebees. What conclusions do you draw from her data? Consider this conclusion. The regression line indicates that bees prefer to visit plants with large flowers. Each data point on this scatter plot represents an alpine sky pilot plant. The number of bee visits to each plant is plotted against fitness. Note that fitness is a relative quantity. The researcher assigned a fitness of 1 to the individual producing the most seeds, and then expressed the fitness of all other plants as a percentage of that number of seeds. What conclusion can you draw from this graph? This point represents the plant with the greatest fitness. Note that it was one of the plants with the most visits by bees. The graph indicates that, in general, plants with a greater number of bee visits will have increased reproductive fitness. However, with real data, there are often exceptions. For example, this plant had the most bee visits, but it also had a very low fitness. There may or may not be another reason for this particular plant's low fitness.